Most people know exactly what Ricky Gervais sounds like when he has something to say. Loud, sharp, completely and unapologetically committed to saying the thing that everyone else in the room has silently agreed not to say. The man who spent 5 consecutive appearances hosting the Golden Globes, looking directly at rooms full of the most powerful and most celebrated people in Hollywood, and delivering observations that made publicists put their phones face down on the table and pray the cameras were not finding their clients' faces in real time. A man who built an entire career, a genuinely extraordinary and historically significant career, on the precise principle that staying quiet, when everyone else would have been the safe and sensible choice, is the one thing he has never been able to bring himself to do. So when Ricky Gervais went quiet, really quiet, not the usual provocation quiet, absence from the platforms where his presence was daily quiet, people noticed immediately. No jokes, no sharp commentary on whatever the internet had decided to be angry about that week. No Golden Globe monologue-style observation about the gap between what powerful people say publicly and what they actually do privately. Just silence. And then 2 words, typed in response to a fan who had asked a simple and gentle question. 2 words. That said more about who Ricky Gervais actually is. Not the persona, not the performance, not the publicly constructed figure that 40 years of television and comedy and deliberate controversy have assembled, than any monologue he has ever delivered from any stage to any audience. Because behind the performance, behind the fame and the controversy, and everything the world thinks it knows about this specific very unusual man, there is a woman he met when he was 20 years old, and she was studying history in the same building where he was supposedly studying philosophy and actually trying to become a pop star. A woman he has never let go of across 44 years of everything that life and success and public exposure can do to a relationship. And in early 2026, that woman received some news that stopped them both in their tracks and reminded the world what the actual center of this story has always been. This is the story of Ricky Gervais and Jane Fallon, the only love of his life, the person who was always there before the fame existed to justify the attention, and the reason that 2 words typed in response to a fan question told more truth about who Ricky Gervais really is than everything else he has ever said put together. Ricky Gervais was born on June 25, 1961, the youngest of 4 children growing up on a council estate in Reading, Berkshire, in the specific circumstances of working-class British life that shape people in ways that fame never fully erases. His father was a Canadian laborer. His mother Eva worked hard to keep the household together and had very specific ideas about what her youngest son should do with his obvious intelligence. When Ricky was young, she gave him a large biology book as a gift and told him she wanted him to become a scientist. He looked at the book, thought about it for a moment with the timing that would eventually become his professional signature, and told her he was going to be a pop star instead. She responded with the specific deadpan authority of a woman who had heard enough nonsense in her life to recognize it immediately. That pop star was just another word for junkie. He arrived at University College London in 1980, officially to study biology, which lasted approximately 2 weeks before he switched to philosophy. He had spent a year before that working as a gardener at the University of Reading, not because it was a plan, but because he needed to do something while he worked out what the actual plan was. And at UCL, he did eventually join a band. The band was called Sayona Dancing, a synth-pop duo assembled with genuine ambition and genuine belief that this was the thing, the moment when everything that was going to happen would start happening. They signed with London Records. They released a single called More to Lose. It charted at number 117. The follow-up, Bitter Heart, climbed all the way to 79. The record label looked at those numbers and said, "That's enough, thanks." The whole thing was over in a year. He has told the story in interviews with the specific deadpan precision of a man who has completely mastered the art of turning his own failures into material. My rock career was 1 year long. 1 year. He went on to manage a young group called Suede, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated and critically beloved British acts of the 1990s. He helped them in their very early days and then had to step back from managing them when the commitment became impossible to maintain alongside everything else he was trying to do. He has noted, without apparent bitterness and with considerable comedic timing, that their career really took off immediately after he left. Good timing, as always. Then came the actual years of The Office, not the television show that would eventually make him famous across 59 countries, but the real and fluorescent lit and deeply ordinary office. The 9 to 5, the meetings about nothing, the filing and the administrative logistics of an industry he was not yet allowed to be creative inside. But he ended up working in the management office of a London entertainment company, doing the kind of work that smart people do when they have not yet found the specific use for their particular kind of intelligence that makes the intelligence itself visible to the people around them. He was 30 years old doing this. He was 32. He had no particular reason visible from the outside to believe that anything was about to change in the ways it eventually did. But what nobody knew, what Ricky has said in interviews that most people never saw because they were too busy watching the Golden Globes clips, was that Jane Fallon was the reason he did not stop trying during those years. She was the one who kept telling him he was funny, not in the way that people say it to be kind, not as the kind of flattery that relationships sometimes generate between people who are trying to protect each other from discouraging truths, in the way someone says it when they genuinely mean it. When they have been watching you long enough and carefully enough to be absolutely certain. She had known him since he was 20 years old. She had watched every failure, the biology degree that lasted 2 weeks, the synth-pop career that lasted 1 year, the Suede management that ended with Suede going on to become famous, the office years, all of it. And she never once suggested he should do something more sensible. He had met her in 1982, in their final year at University College London. She was studying history, he was studying philosophy, and failing to become a pop star. The exact circumstances of how they started talking have been described differently in different interviews across different years, which is usually a reliable indicator that it was the kind of meeting that becomes a story only in retrospect, that did not announce itself at the time as the beginning of something that would last 44 years. What is certain is that by the time they both graduated, they were together, and 2 years later, in 1984, they moved in together. The flat was a single room in King's Cross, and not the polished, regenerated, artisanal coffee King's Cross of the present. King's Cross in 1984 was rough in the specific and particular way that parts of London were rough then, the kind of neighborhood where things happened at night that did not bear close examination in the morning. Their room was above what Ricky has described as some sort of seedy sauna. They had a bed, a fridge, and each other. He could reach the fridge from the bed. He has said this, not with embarrassment, not with the apologetic framing that people sometimes apply to periods of material difficulty, but with genuine warmth. The specific warmth of someone talking about a time when they had essentially nothing, and it turned out to be enough because the person they were sharing the nothing with was exactly right. Jane was building a career in television entirely on her own terms and entirely on the strength of her own judgment during those same years. She became a script editor and then a producer, working on EastEnders, on This Life, the mid-1990s drama that defined an entire generation of British television viewers and remains one of the most respected and most talked about pieces of British television from that era, and on Teachers. 2 decades of serious and consequential professional work, not as Ricky Gervais's girlfriend or partner or the person adjacent to someone who would eventually become famous, as Jane Fallon, the producer, someone who had built a professional identity entirely independent of anything Ricky was doing or going to do. That independence, the fact that Jane was genuinely and documentably her own person professionally throughout the entire period when Ricky was figuring out what his professional identity was going to be, is one of the most important details in understanding what their relationship actually was and is. She was not a supportive presence waiting in the background while someone else's story unfolded. She was living her own equally significant story in parallel, which made her assessment of Ricky's talent specifically valuable, because it was not the assessment of someone who needed to believe in him. It was the assessment of someone who understood the creative and professional landscape well enough to know what genuine talent looked like, and who kept saying she saw it in him during the years when the evidence available to most observers did not obviously support that conclusion. Ricky, in the same years, was still circling the thing he had not yet found. The XFM radio show came in the late 1990s. He got a job behind the scenes at the alternative London station and immediately recognized, with the self-awareness that would eventually become one of his defining professional characteristics, that he had no idea what he was doing. So he taught himself. The show he eventually built was unlike anything else on British radio at the time. Loose, honest, driven by the kind of observation that made listeners feel they were overhearing something genuinely true, rather than consuming something that had been produced and shaped to generate a specific response. It was the first place where the version of Ricky Gervais that the world would eventually recognize showed up clearly and consistently, and it was there that he met Stephen Merchant, working in production at the station. The two of them started talking and riffing and discovering that they had a shared and specific fascination with the comedy of office life, the accidentally devastating tragedy of a man who believed himself to be charismatic and beloved and essential, while every camera angle told an entirely different story. In 1998, they made a test tape they called a pre-pilot. The character at the center was David Brent, middle manager at a paper company in Slough, whose bottomless and completely undisguised need for approval was visible to absolutely everyone in the building except himself. Ricky played him with a precision and a commitment and a specific quality of recognition that suggested he had been studying this particular species of person across his entire working life. He had been watching David Brent in every office, in every band meeting, in every management role he had ever occupied or observed. David Brent was not invented. He was assembled from years of careful and merciless observation. The BBC commissioned The Office. It premiered in 2001. And then the audience research scores came back, and they were not good. They were, by multiple accounts, among the lowest scores the BBC had recorded for a new commission in years. The only program that had apparently scored lower in recent memory was Women's Lawn Bowls. Conversations began inside the BBC about whether the commission had been a mistake. Ricky Gervais did not panic, and the reason he did not panic is one of the most revealing things about who he actually is beneath all the performance. He was 40 years old when The Office premiered. He had not spent 2 decades desperately and anxiously needing to be on television. He had spent 2 decades working in offices and failing at pop music and watching Jane build a serious and creditable career while he figured out what his was going to be. So when the BBC told him the numbers were bad, he looked at those numbers and essentially said, "All right then, see you." He did not have the specific paralyzing fear that comes from needing something to work because your entire identity depends on its success. And that absence of fear was what let The Office be exactly what it needed to be, without anyone softening the edges or adjusting toward something more palatable. The show found its audience, slowly and then completely and then overwhelmingly. By the time it won the Golden Globe for Best Television Series in 2004, it had sold to 59 countries and was being remade in America, where it would run for 9 seasons on NBC and become arguably the most successful and most beloved sitcom in the history of American network television. Ricky Gervais stood at the Golden Globes at 42 years old and accepted an award for a show that had been beaten in its original test audience scores by Lawn Bowls. Jane was in that room. She has been present at every significant moment across 4 decades. Not as decoration, not as the accessory that famous people bring to important events to communicate what they want the world to see about them, as the actual person he talked to before and after, as the one whose reaction to what was happening mattered more than anyone else's. He has said this, in more than one interview, without apparent self-consciousness, that she is smarter than him. That she is funnier than him in one-on-one conversation. That when he is trying to determine whether something he is making is actually good, she is the person whose opinion he trusts more than anyone else on the planet. "I always check with Jane," he told one interviewer. "She's the person who'll tell me straight." She always has been. The 5 Golden Globes hosting appearances deserve specific attention because they are the most visible public expression of who Ricky Gervais has decided to be at the point in his career when the world's most powerful entertainment industry was literally the audience in front of him. In 2020, his 5th time behind that microphone, he told the room that Apple had made a television show about the importance of dignity and workplace decency using a company that runs sweatshops in China. He told them that if they won awards that evening, they should come up, say thank you, and go home, because nobody in the watching public actually cared about their political opinions. He said it calmly. He said it with a smile. He said it with absolutely no indication that he planned to apologize afterward. He did not. He has said in interviews that he believes the quest to be popular is fundamentally incompatible with making art that is actually worth making. If it happens, great. If you aim at it, you will come unstuck. That is a principle that requires real conviction to maintain when you are standing in a room full of people who can make or break careers with a single phone call and who are not finding your observations particularly funny. And the source of that conviction, the place where it was formed and reinforced across decades of professional life, is the woman who told him he was funny before he had any evidence to support the claim. Jane, in those same years of Ricky's mounting public fame and controversy, had completed her own equally significant professional transition. She had left television entirely and had become a novelist. Her first book, Getting Rid of Matthew, published in 2006, became a bestseller. So did the books that followed. She has published more than 10 novels, sharp, emotionally precise, genuinely funny in the specific way that requires actual intelligence rather than simply a facility for jokes, and she built a readership entirely on the strength of her own writing and her own voice. In 2020, University College London awarded her an honorary fellowship, an acknowledgement from the institution where she had met Ricky that she had built something substantial and lasting entirely in her own right. They never married. When asked about this across 4 decades of interviews, both of them have been completely consistent and completely untroubled by the question. She told the Daily Mail that neither of them were fussed about it, that if one of them really cared, they would probably do it, but it had never been something either of them genuinely needed. He framed it in his own characteristically direct way, that they were married in everything but the ceremony, that they shared everything, that everything was in both their names, that they had lived together for over 30 years. "How are we not married?" he asked, "except in the eyes of God." They also never had children. This was, like the marriage question, a mutual decision that both of them arrived at without apparent internal conflict and have discussed across decades of being asked about it without drama or defensiveness. The answer has never changed and never seemed to cost either of them the telling. What they had instead were cats, kept with the specific and genuine devotion of people who find in animals an uncomplicated form of daily love that requires nothing and offers everything in return, and each other, and the work, and the particular texture of a life built by 2 people who chose each other every single day across 44 years, not because the paperwork required it, not because social convention demanded it, but because on each successive day it remained the right choice. What rarely gets discussed honestly is the actual cost of being Ricky Gervais during the years when the internet decided he was a problem that needed to be addressed. His material on religion and celebrity attracted sustained and sometimes frightening public hostility. He received death threats, mentioned in interviews without elaboration, because he has consistently refused to give that kind of thing more weight than it deserves through the act of dwelling on it publicly. Jane has never spoken publicly about what those years were like from the inside of their home, from the perspective of the person who was there when the door closed and the performance stopped. But she was there, and she stayed. He has said that she is the person he comes home to after all of it, that the house is quiet and the cats are there and Jane is there, and that is the thing around which everything else is organized and from which everything else derives its meaning. "I could have had a massive house," he said once, "but I would rather have been comfortable and creative and had Jane." He said it simply, without arranging it into a speech or a sentiment designed to land with a particular effect, which is precisely how he tends to say the things he actually believes, as if the truth of them is obvious, and the only question is whether to say it out loud. Then came March of 2026. Jane Fallon posted a selfie on Instagram wearing a black t-shirt. At the top of the image, in simple text, "Bit of news." At the bottom, "No one panic." A month earlier, she wrote, she had been diagnosed with breast cancer, very early stage. The prognosis was excellent. This was the first thing she established and the thing she returned to throughout the post, not to minimize what she was going through, but to be honest about the full picture. She had gone for a routine mammogram just before Christmas with no symptoms, nothing to indicate anything was wrong, and a radiographer had spotted something iffy and sent her for further tests, then a biopsy, then more mammograms, more biopsies, an MRI to pinpoint the problem area precisely. Surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks from the post. She wanted to get it over with. She was getting incredible care and all will be fine, she wrote. But in the meantime, she was not engaging with much beyond audiobooks and jigsaws. She posted 2 more pictures alongside the selfie. One was a stuffed bear called Dr. Eric, wearing a toy stethoscope. The other was her cat Pickle, whom Jane had hand-drawn in a purple nurse's uniform. "Dr. Eric on duty," she wrote. "Nurse Pickle wondering when lunch is." It was, in the most complete and recognizable way, the Jane Fallon way of handling something frightening, with humor that did not minimize the fear, but held space beside it, with honesty that did not ask for sympathy, but simply told the truth of what was happening. With the specific comfort of small and familiar things, the stuffed bear, the cat in a hand-drawn uniform, the jigsaw puzzles, that communicate something real about how a particular kind of person faces something difficult. The instruction not to panic was directed at her readers and followers and the people who knew and cared about her. But it was also a description of how she herself was approaching the situation. Not without fear, she was frightened and she said so. Not without difficulty, she said it had been a lot, but with the specific and dignified refusal to make her fear someone else's problem or allow her situation to become a public performance of suffering. Ricky Gervais went quiet. For a man whose presence on social media platforms is typically daily, whose commentary on events and ideas and human behavior flows with a consistency that makes his silence immediately noticeable, this specific quiet was immediately and widely registered. No jokes, no provocations, no observations on whatever the world was arguing about that particular week, no Golden Globe-style observations delivered from the comfort of his own social media profile, just absence. And then, when a fan asked him gently and simply how Jane was doing, just that, nothing more, he typed 2 words into the response: "Doing well, thank you." And then he went back to silence. The man who has built an entire life and an entire career on saying the things that other people have agreed not to say. The man who looked at the most powerful room in Hollywood 5 consecutive times and said exactly what he thought of the people in it, with a smile and zero apparent concern for the consequences. That man typed 2 words and stopped, because the rest of it was Jane's, and Jane's alone, and he knew it. With complete and evident certainty, he knew it. There is a line he has used when people ask what comedy is really about, what it actually is underneath all the performance and the craft and the deliberate construction. "The funniest person you know," he has said, "is not a professional comedian. It is your dad, or your granddad, or your uncle. Because someone has to walk into a pub, and you see them do a double take, and you know what they are thinking, And that is why you laugh. It is about empathy. You laugh at something because you already know what the right thing is, and recognizing the distance between what is happening and what the right thing is produces the laugh. He built an entire career on that principle. The Office worked because audiences recognized David Brent's specific and devastating self-deception. Extras worked because the celebrities playing themselves revealed something true about what fame costs people. Afterlife worked because grief was rendered with a specific honesty that made the comedy land harder precisely because the sadness underneath it was real. Comedy, for Ricky Gervais, has always been empathy in a different costume, and the person who taught him to trust that instinct, who told him the thing he actually was worth waiting for, during all the years when what he actually was remained largely invisible to most observers, was always Jane. He met her in 1982. Two students with no money and no particular plan, at a university in London, at a moment when neither of them had any specific reason to believe they were standing at the beginning of anything significant. They moved into a single room above a seedy sauna because it was what they could afford. He has never fully left that room. She has never fully left it either. And at 65, after everything, the fame and the controversy and the death threats and the 5 Golden Globes appearances and the years of fighting to own his own creative work and the decade of Netflix and the cats and the novels and all of it, the most honest and most revealing and most essential thing about Ricky Gervais is still the simplest. He found the right person before he found any of the rest of it, and he never once let go. If this story moved you, if you have ever loved someone quietly and consistently for a long time, without ceremony or paperwork or public witness, simply because on each successive day it remained the obviously right thing, leave a comment below. And here is the question worth sitting with today. Is it possible that the most extraordinary thing a person can do with a life, more extraordinary than 5 Golden Globes, more extraordinary than creating the most successful British sitcom in the history of American television, more extraordinary than any award or record or achievement that the public world keeps score of, is simply to choose someone, every morning, for 44 years, without ceremony, without requiring anyone else to witness it, without needing anything to be proven or demonstrated or performed for an external audience, because Ricky Gervais typed 2 words and stopped, and in those 2 words was 44 years of exactly that.